In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about South Carolina and its leaders at the Constitutional Convention, that leader being Charles Pinckney, a Low-Country planter from the area around Charleston. In the previous lesson, we learned about South Carolina and the United States economic situation after the American Revolution. Both experienced depression and indebtedness. The United States depression and indebtedness was in some cases because of the Articles of Confederation and the inability of the national or federal government to tax. The event that would cause the Articles of Confederation to be examined and perhaps a new government to be written would be the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts. This was, of course, between the coastal elite and backcountry folk in Massachusetts. After Shays' Rebellion, Americans would be calling for a stronger national government, even though fears of a king led to the creation of a weak, incredibly weak national government. Shays' Rebellion would show that if the U.S. were to survive, a stronger national government would needed to be created. The decision to either amend the Articles of Confederation or write a new constitution occurred in 1787 at the Philadelphia Convention, which would become known as the Constitutional Convention. Here, this was called to solve the problems of the Articles of Confederation. Whether to amend the Articles of Confederation, as small states like New Jersey wanted to, or to totally write a new constitution like states as Virginia and South Carolina wanted to. South Carolina supported a stronger national government and the writing of a new constitution. They also supported a three-branch government, which would become known as which was also an aspect of the Virginia Plan, which had a legislative for making laws, an executive for enforcing the laws, and a judicial for interpreting the constitutionality of the laws. South Carolina also supported a strong executive with a term of 6 to 7 years rather than the 4-year term that was agreed upon, and showing that South Carolina continued to want South Carolina and many of the states to be an aristocratic republic with the elite mainly in control. They wanted only property holders to be able to hold office. There would be many compromises that would have to be made, and the first of these would be known as the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was a combination of two plans of government. The New Jersey called for equal representation for each state and a unicameral legislature that was under the Articles of Confederation. They also just called for amending the Articles of Confederation. However, large states like Virginia desired the writing of a new constitution and the formation of a bicameral legislature. This bicameral legislature, though, would be based on population. Large states would have more power in this legislature, and it would give those states more voice in the government. South Carolina liked the Virginia plan due to its large population. A compromise was reached where we would have aspects of both plans. This compromise, which created our bicameral legislature, was called the Great Compromise. South Carolina supported it. In the Great Compromise, we would have two houses of government. One would have equal representation, as New Jersey desired. The New Jersey plan set forth, called the Senate. And other house would have proportional representation, and it would be called the House of Representatives, which was based on the Virginia plan's idea of proportional or population-based representation. An example is New Hampshire and Louisiana both have two senators, while New Hampshire, with less population, has two representatives in the House, while Louisiana, which has a greater population, has 7 representatives in the House. This here would be aspects of the New Jersey plan, which small states liked, and this would be aspects of the Virginia plan, which large states liked. So, we pick up there, which is after the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise created the bicameral legislature that we have today. Of course, that was an aspect of the Virginia plan. But what differed from the Virginia plan was one of those houses would be entirely equal representation. Small states and big states agreed. And I imagine there was a big party. However, one person started to think at this party, and his thought would lead to the need for further discussion and further compromise. So as everybody is dancing around and cheering, someone started to think about specifically the population-based part of the legislature. And what they started to think about was, what about slaves? How will they count for population? Well, as this circulated throughout the room, of course, the slave states started to think about this as well, and Charles Pinckney and other slave states and the South Carolina delegates, they, of course, even though slaves were considered property to their owners, they wanted them counted equally. And Charles Pinckney probably yelled out, "They better be counted equally." However, the northern states who had started to emancipate their slaves in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence started to say, well, they're property to you. They shouldn't be counted at all for representational purposes. South Carolina and the other slave states, of course, had lots of slaves. And if the slaves were counted, South Carolina would have more representation in the House of Representatives, and therefore greater political power. Once again, South Carolina and the other slave-holding states wanted slaves counted as full individuals. However, the North had begun emancipating their slaves, which was in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. And this is not entirely based upon the Declaration of Independence, however, even though the Declaration of Independence said that all men are created equal, and that was the intellectual justification. The northern states also did not have an economy that was based on slave labor. However, the primary reason was that some started to view that if we're going to send a message to the king and state that all men are created equal, well, it's just kind of hypocritical to continue to have slaves. To go back to the play, it wasn't Charles Pinckney that actually brought that up. It was this guy from South Carolina, who we will learn more about, called Elbridge Gerry, who said, "Just a minute, will southern states be allowed to count slaves as population?" This is, I believe, Edward Rutledge, who we learned about, who signed the Declaration of Independence. He says, "Of course slaves should be counted. Their labor is worth just as much as anyone else." We can see from this part of the play that Gerry is actually on the side of not counting the slaves. In the South, you treat African Americans as property. If the South can count slaves, the North shall be able to count any of its property. Well, the South says that if we cannot count our slaves, this convention will be at an end, and the convention turns into an uproar. However, a compromise was achieved as to how slaves would be counted. The compromise that would be officially recognized was called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And in the Three-Fifths Compromise, it was decided that 5 slaves would count as 3 people for population purposes. So, the compromise was agreed because if there was not a compromise, there would be no further progress made at the Philadelphia Convention. Southern states were still dissatisfied with this compromise, and Charles Pinckney in South Carolina were not happy, which I will exhibit by Charles Pinckney's angry face, who continued to want slaves to be counted fully. So South Carolina was never happy with the Three-Fifths Compromise. However, due to concessions that things that South Carolina wanted concerning trade would be taken into consideration, eventually the Three-Fifths Compromise was accepted, but not happily. South Carolina does not like the Three-Fifths Compromise. So, once they calmed Charles Pinckney down and Edward Rutledge, they are content but not happy about the Three-Fifths Compromise. And they know that the South Carolina planters are not going to be happy about this either. Regardless, the Three-Fifths Compromise determined the way by which slaves would be counted for the House of Representatives. Had South Carolina been able to count the slaves equally as the delegates from South Carolina and the other southern states wanted, then South Carolina would have more power in the House of Representatives. But that's not what happened. 5 slaves count as 3. So South Carolina probably had around 500,000 slaves back then, which means when they tally up the votes, they will be able to count that 500,000 as 300,000. And roughly every 100,000 people in the state would get one representative in the House of Representatives. South Carolina and the southern states agreed to the Three-Fifths Compromise because of promises that other economic interests would be taken into consideration. And in trade and commerce, South Carolina and the other southern states disagreed with the federal regulation of trade. And the trade and commerce would be known as the Commerce Compromise. Now, the discourse for the Commerce Compromise went something like this. The South opposed the federal regulation of trade. And the reason is South Carolina exports lots, cash crops, and they import slaves. So, if a tax on exports was a federal tax on exports, this would affect the value of exports that Carolina sells. And if the federal government were to tax imports, this would affect the price of slaves. So South Carolina and Charles Pinckney pretty much said, okay, we gave in on the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's okay. I don't feel like this anymore, but we still don't agree. But we object to any regulation, the federal regulation of trade, because South Carolina exports cash crops and because South Carolina imports slaves. So, the members of the convention realized that the South really never agreed with the Three-Fifths Compromise, even though it seemed reasonable. And by them accepting it, they helped the proceedings continue at the Constitutional Convention. So, what was agreed was the Commerce Compromise, which the Commerce Compromise said the following. Okay, South Carolina and the southern states. In the Commerce Compromise, we agree that there will be no tax on exports or regulation of the slave trade for 20 years. This means all the slaves can keep coming in tax-free and all of your exported cash crops can keep being sold to foreign countries tax-free. So, in the end, these were the major compromises, and South Carolina, although not entirely happy, was satisfied. Said, cool, I didn't say cool back then. We didn't get everything we wanted, but overall, we are satisfied. So, we learned about 3 compromises, one being the Great Compromise, which created the bicameral legislature we have today. 2, the Three-Fifths Compromise, which would determine the role slaves would play in determining population. And 3, the Commerce Compromise, which would determine the import-export status and the ability of the federal government to tax those, which the Commerce Compromise, once again, said no tax on exports and no regulation of the slave trade for 20 years. And in the end, South Carolina was satisfied. This completes the lesson for today. In the next one, we will review these things and learn about what happens next in order for South Carolina and the rest of the potential members of the United States to become official members of the new United States. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.